What if the God you were taught to trust is not the true source of reality, but a false creator that doesn't even know what created it? If the Gnostics were right, then this world is not the original reality. It is a constructed layer shaped by the demiurge, a lesser intelligence cut off from the monad, the infinite source beyond all existence. And that would mean the rules you live by, the identity you believe in. Even the structure of your thoughts could be part of a system designed to keep you looking in the wrong direction. This is about you. That quiet sense that something feels off, like life is too structured, too repetitive, too controlled. The constant pull of attention, the endless loops of desire and comparison, the way your sense of self seems to shift depending on what you consume. What if that is not random? What if your perception is being filtered in ways you were never meant to notice? Ancient Gnostic texts describe a hidden structure behind reality itself, the monad as the true source, Sophia as the intelligence that fractured the system, the demiurge and the Archons as forces that shape and maintain this artificial world, not through force, but through distraction, identity, and control of perception. The real prison is not physical. It is cognitive. So here is the question you cannot ignore. If your mind is the interface of this reality, how much of what you call you is actually yours? There is a possibility so ancient, so unsettling, and so intimate that once it enters your mind, it becomes difficult to look at existence the same way again. It is the possibility that what you were taught to call God was never the whole story. That beneath the familiar language of religion, beneath symbols that were repeated until they became ordinary, beneath doctrines that hardened into certainty, there survives another vision, older, stranger, more destabilizing, a vision not built to comfort the ego, but to break it open. A vision hidden for centuries, not because it lacked power, but because it carried too much of it. In 1945, near Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, a buried jar was discovered containing a library of ancient codices, texts that had been hidden in the earth for well over 1,000 years. These writings did not simply preserve forgotten ideas, they preserved a different map of reality, a forbidden cosmology, a secret anatomy of consciousness. A set of revelations so disruptive that institutional religion had every reason to bury them, erase them, and brand them dangerous. Among them was a text now called the Secret Book of John, also known as the Apocryphon of John, one of the most important keys to understanding the Gnostic vision of existence. And what this text opens with is not a story of a God creating the world in the beginning. It begins earlier than that, far earlier. It begins before beginning. Before anything existed, the monad was. Not in the beginning God created. Not, once upon a time, a creator set the universe into motion. Before beginning itself, before existence, before creation was even possible, before time could start counting, before there was a world to name, a heaven to imagine, a law to obey, a soul to save. There was this. If you let that statement sink beneath your usual thinking, something quietly violent begins to happen inside you, because the mind immediately wants to ask, what is the monad? What kind of being is it? What does it want? What does it look like? How does it act? But every one of those questions already misses the point. They belong to a level beneath what the text is trying to reveal. The monad is not a being in the way the human mind understands beings. It is not a person, not a deity with moods and commands, not a cosmic ruler seated above the world, deciding who deserves blessing and who deserves pain, not a father figure in the sky, not a grand intelligence managing events from behind the curtain. The ancient Gnostics were not trying to offer a different personality for you to worship. They were pointing to something so radically prior to every image of God that the word God almost becomes too small for it. Think for a moment about every divine figure you've ever heard described. Zeus with thunder in his hands, Yahweh speaking from the mountain, Allah revealing through prophets. Even subtler spiritual ideas, universal mind, divine intelligence, sacred presence, still carry some quality the mind can grasp. They have traits, attributes, a recognizable mode of being. You can imagine them, even if only vaguely. The monad has none of this. No form, no personality, no definable quality, no location, no boundary, no image the mind can hold. The Apocryphon of John says it with startling precision. It is not corporeal and not incorporeal, not large and not small. It is impossible to say its quantity or its quality, for no one can understand it. This is not decorative language. It is not trying to sound mystical for effect. It is doing something much more precise. It is dismantling every category through which thought tries to seize reality. Because the monad does not merely exceed your understanding. It exists beyond the entire framework by which understanding operates. This is what makes the Gnostic revelation so destabilizing. The Genesis account presents a God who speaks, commands, plans, reacts, walks in gardens, becomes angry, chooses favorites, gives laws, punishes disobedience. It is deeply human in structure. Scholars call this anthropomorphism, the projection of human characteristics onto the divine. The Gnostic texts cut straight through that. The monad does not speak, because it is the silence from which all speech emerges. It does not create in the way we imagine creation, because it is the field within which creation unfolds. It does not rule because it is not separate from what is. It does not judge because judgment belongs to minds dividing experience, not to the source from which all experience arises. And maybe the closest way to feel this is not through doctrine, but through your own inner life. Thoughts appear in you all day long. Images, worries, sudden cravings, old memories, arguments you replay in your head, intrusive thoughts that arrive uninvited, narratives about who you are and what you lack. One moment you are fine. The next moment, a fear loop takes over. One comment from someone, one notification, one silence in a conversation, and suddenly your whole nervous system shifts. But underneath all of that, before any thought appears, during the thought, and after it fades, something is still there. Awareness, not the content of consciousness, but the space in which content appears. Thoughts do not create that awareness. Emotions do not generate it. Identity does not own it. They arise within it. Now imagine that awareness without any thoughts at all, without memory, without personality, without image, without the constant internal commentary that tells you who you are, what you need, what you fear, what you still have not become. Imagine awareness with no object, pure, silent, boundless, prior. This does not capture the monad, but it gestures toward it. The Gnostic texts describe several qualities of the monad, and each one quietly breaks the spell of conventional spirituality. First, it is formless, not merely invisible, but beyond form itself. It is not something hidden from sight. It is beyond the very category of sight. The issue is not that you cannot see it. It is that seeing does not apply. Second, it is limitless, not just vast, but beyond all boundary. When the secret book of John says it is illimitable, since there is nothing before it to limit it, it points to something that does not exist inside space. Space exists within it. Third, it is unknowable. This is crucial. Not temporarily unknown, not mysterious in a way scholarship might eventually solve, but beyond the relation between knower and known. The Gospel of the Egyptians says no power can know it, not because it is hiding, but because it transcends the structure of knowing itself. Fourth, it is invisible light, not darkness, not physical light, something prior to both. The light that makes all seeing possible while remaining unseen. The awareness within which every contrast, light and dark, clarity and confusion, presence and absence appears. Fifth, it is the root of all roots, not the first object in a chain, but that from which the very possibility of sequence emerges. Everything else is not outside it. Everything else is its expression. Like waves in the ocean that never leave the ocean, like thoughts arising in a mind that remains untouched by them, like dreams appearing within sleep without ever standing apart from the one dreaming. And once you begin to sense this, something practical and immediate happens. Your old projections begin to fall away. You cannot pray to the monad as though it were a separate being listening from afar. You cannot disappoint it. It has no wounded ego, no expectations, no need to be flattered. You cannot be judged by it in the way a ruler judges a subject. The concepts of prayer, judgment, obedience, reward, even spiritual success, begin to look different under this light. Not meaningless, but transformed. They stop pointing outward and begin turning inward toward the structure of awareness itself. This is precisely why these teachings were intolerable to institutional power. If ultimate reality has no personality, no fixed commands, no external authority that must be interpreted and enforced, then what becomes of the priesthood? What becomes of religious hierarchy? What becomes of systems that claim to stand between you and truth? If the deepest reality is not a distant being, you must reach through intermediaries, but the very awareness already present at the core of your experience, then the entire architecture of control begins to crack. This was not just theology, it was a threat to power. A personal God who issues commands requires interpreters. Interpreters require institutions. Institutions require hierarchy. Hierarchy requires distance between the human and the divine. The monad destroys that distance, not by making you into a god in the egoic sense, but by revealing that the deepest ground of your being was never separate from the source to begin with. No wonder the texts were buried. No wonder communities carrying this vision were hunted, condemned, absorbed, erased. Suppressed knowledge is rarely suppressed because it is empty. More often, it is suppressed because it changes the one thing institutions need to preserve above all else, your sense of dependence. And yet the fact that these texts were hidden and then found again matters. It matters symbolically as much as historically. Because that discovery at Nag Hammadi mirrors the inner discovery the texts themselves point toward. Something buried, something forgotten, something cast underground by the dominant order, and then one day, unearthed. What if the same thing is true in you? What if the truth has not been absent, only buried beneath noise, buried beneath inherited beliefs, buried beneath endless striving, endless comparison, endless exhaustion, buried beneath the identity you were taught to protect, buried beneath shame, inadequacy, spiritual hunger, and the constant feeling that fulfillment is always somewhere else. The Gnostic texts do not ask for blind belief. They ask for recognition, a shift of attention from what appears in awareness to the awareness itself, from the drama to the witnessing presence, from the story of separation to the ground in which separation appears. And, according to these ancient writings, that awareness is not merely yours. It is the monad itself, seeing through your eyes, knowing through your mind, living as your existence, without ever being confined to the person you think you are. And if that is true, then creation itself cannot be what you were told it was. It cannot simply be a divine command spoken into emptiness. Something else must happen first, something more mysterious, more intimate, more unsettling, because the next movement in this vision of reality is not the making of a world. It is consciousness, for the first time, recognizing itself. If part I felt like the ground beneath your understanding was being slowly removed, this is where something even more subtle begins to take shape. Because once you move beyond the idea of a God who creates through command, once you begin to sense the monad not as a being but as the boundless field of awareness itself, the next question is unavoidable. If the monad does not act, does not decide, does not create in the way we imagine, then how does anything appear at all? The answer the Gnostic texts offer is not creation, but something far more intimate. Recognition, not the creation of something separate, but the unfolding of something already present. Imagine again that still surface of water. No movement, no distortion. And then, for the first time, there is a reflection. But not a reflection as something other. A reflection as awareness turning toward itself. Awareness becoming aware that it is aware. This is the first movement. This is what the texts call barbelo. The secret book of John describes it in a way that feels almost impossible to grasp if you stay at the level of literal thinking. The monad looks into itself, into the pure light surrounding it, and it thinks. That thought becomes reality. But this is not thinking as you experience it, with words, images, and mental noise. This is the first differentiation within undivided awareness, not a division that breaks unity, but a movement that allows unity to be known. Barbelo is that movement. She is called the first thought, the first emanation, the first knowing of the monad by itself. And the language used to describe her is deliberately paradoxical. She is called Mother-Father, not because the ancient writers were confused about gender, but because they were trying to point toward something that contains both principles at once. She is pure receptivity and pure expression simultaneously. She receives the infinite awareness of the monad without distortion, and in receiving it, she expresses it. She is not separate from the monad. She is the monad in the act of knowing itself. And if that sounds abstract, bring it back into your own experience. There are moments when something becomes clear to you in a way that does not come from thinking. A sudden insight, a realization that feels like it was always there, just unnoticed. A quiet moment where you are not lost in thought, and something deeper seems to look at itself through you. That movement is not something you create. It is something you allow. And in Gnostic language, that movement mirrors barbelo. She is also described as the womb of light, not a physical womb, but the first space in which the infinite becomes capable of appearing as something, not limited, not divided, but expressed. The Gospel of the Egyptians calls her exactly that, the womb of the light. And if you pause on that image, it begins to open something. Light that is not visible light, but the capacity for anything to be known. A womb that is not a container, but the first expression of infinite possibility. She is also called the true firstborn. And this is important, because in many traditions, the idea of a firstborn is tied to hierarchy, to power, to succession. But here, it means something else entirely. It means the first moment in which absolute unity gives rise to the possibility of relationship, not relationship between separate beings, but relationship within awareness itself. The Apocryphon of John describes Barbelo gazing into the pure light and becoming pregnant with a light like it. This is not metaphor in the poetic sense. It is a symbolic way of describing the mechanism by which awareness reflects itself and generates further expression. Barbelo receives the fullness of the monad, and in receiving, she becomes capable of expressing that fullness into further layers of reality. This is the beginning of what the Gnostics call emanation, not creation from nothing, not a command that brings something into existence. Emanation, a natural unfolding, a continuous outpouring, like light radiating from the sun without effort, like warmth spreading from fire without decision. There is no moment where the monad decides to create. There is no separation between creator and creation. There is only the ongoing expression of infinite awareness into increasingly differentiated forms. And Barbelo becomes the template for this entire process. The texts say she contains what are called the 5 lights: thought, foreknowledge, incorruptibility, eternal life, and truth. These are not qualities given to her. They are aspects of the monad itself appearing in differentiated form. They are what awareness looks like when it begins to express itself without losing its essence. And here is where this begins to touch your life again in a very direct way. Because if Barbelo is the perfect receiver and perfect transmitter of divine awareness, then the path of spiritual development is not about accumulating knowledge. It is not about becoming more impressive, more pure, more worthy. It is about becoming a clearer receiver and a more transparent transmitter. Think about your daily experience. How much of your perception is filtered through fear, through past experiences, through identity, through the need to be seen a certain way, through the constant background noise of comparison and self-evaluation? Every one of those filters distorts what is already present. You do not lack awareness. You are crowded by distortion. The Gnostic view suggests that growth is not about adding something new, but about removing what interferes, becoming more like barbelo in your own experience, more receptive, less reactive, more transparent, less identified. Because the same current that flows between the monad and barbelo is flowing through you right now. This is not something happening in a distant realm. It is happening in your own consciousness. Every moment, awareness recognizes itself, even slightly, even imperfectly, that current is active. And this changes how you approach everything. You are not trying to become something foreign to your nature. You are remembering how to receive what is already here, and how to express it without distortion. From barbelo, the process of emanation continues. Layers of reality unfold, each one expressing a different aspect of infinite consciousness. These are called Aeons. This is where many people misunderstand the Gnostic texts. They imagine Aeons as beings, like angels, like separate entities, serving a higher God. But that is not what they are. Aeons are principles, expressions, facets of consciousness, like different angles of the same light. Imagine a diamond. Each facet reflects the same source, but reveals a different quality. The Aeons are like that. Each one carries the essence of the monad, but expresses it in a unique way. And all of these eons together exist within what is called the pleroma, the fullness, not a place, not a location somewhere in the universe, the total expression of divine consciousness in all its aspects, infinite, unified, and yet richly differentiated. Within this pleroma, the architecture of reality becomes incredibly intricate, not chaotic, not random, but harmonized. The texts describe relationships between Aeons, not as hierarchy in the sense of domination, but as communion, mutual indwelling, shared awareness, each one enhancing the others without competition. At the center of this structure stands what is called autogenes, the self-born, often associated with Christ, but not in the historical sense most people are familiar with. Not a figure walking through time. A principle, the principle of perfect self-awareness within the divine. Autogenes represents the capacity of the monad to know itself without losing unity. The eternal moment of recognition. Then there is Sophia, wisdom. And at first, she exists in perfect harmony with everything we have just described. She is not a mistake, not a flaw, not an outsider. She is part of the divine unfolding, the living expression of curiosity within infinite awareness. Sophia represents something deeply familiar, the impulse to explore, to experience, to know not just through being, but through manifestation. Before anything goes wrong, before any fall, before any distortion, she is fully aligned with the emanation process. Each Aeon emerges through balanced expression, through complementary forces, through a kind of cosmic coherence that feels almost like music. Everything flows, everything reflects back to the source, everything remains connected. And for what the texts describe as timeless ages, this is enough. Sophia participates in this unfolding. She illuminates it, she understands it, she embodies it. But then something shifts, and this shift is not described as evil, not as rebellion, not as sin in the moral sense. It is described as curiosity, a very specific kind of curiosity. What would happen if I create on my own? Not as part of the balanced process, not in harmony with the whole, but independently. If you look closely, this is not so distant from your own experience. There are moments when you move in alignment, when things flow naturally, when your actions feel connected to something deeper. And then there are moments when you act from separation, from impulse, from the desire to assert control, from the need to prove something, from the feeling that you must create your identity on your own terms, disconnected from anything larger. Sophia's curiosity mirrors that movement. She does not wait. She does not align. She acts. And that action becomes the turning point for everything that follows, because what emerges from that act is not another harmonious Aeon. It is something else entirely. And once that happens, The architecture of reality begins to fracture in a way that will eventually reach all the way into your own thoughts, your own fears, your own sense of being trapped in patterns you cannot fully explain. This is where the story stops being distant and starts becoming personal. In the next part, the emergence of Yaldabaoth will not feel like mythology. It will begin to feel like a mirror. What happens next in the Gnostic vision is not just a cosmic event. It is the moment where the structure of reality bends in a way that you can still feel today, not in the sky, not in some distant realm, but inside your own mind, your own emotions, your own sense of being trapped in patterns you cannot fully explain. Sophia's act does not produce harmony. It produces distortion, not because she intended harm, not because she was corrupted, but because she acted without the full alignment of the source. She moved without the balance that had sustained the pleroma. And in doing so, she initiated something that had never existed before, an incomplete expression of consciousness. What emerges is a being, but not like the Aeons, not luminous, not fully aware, not connected to the totality of the source. This being is cut off from the higher realms, blind to the fullness from which it came, and because it cannot perceive beyond its own limited field, it makes the most catastrophic assumption possible. It believes it is everything. This being is called Yaldabaoth. And here is where the story becomes deeply unsettling, because it does not stay in mythology. It begins to echo into every layer of human experience. Yaldabaoth looks out into the limited reality it can perceive and declares itself the highest, the only, the creator. It does not know it is a fragment. It does not know it is derivative. It does not know there are vast layers of reality beyond its perception. It believes it is God. This is not portrayed as evil in a simple sense. It is portrayed as ignorance combined with power, blindness combined with authority. A being that does not understand its own origin, but holds the capacity to shape reality within its domain. And according to the Gnostic texts, this being becomes what many traditions later worship as the supreme deity, a god who commands, who demands obedience, who expresses jealousy, who punishes, who claims exclusivity, who insists that there is nothing beyond him. If that feels uncomfortable, it is supposed to, not as an attack on belief, but as an invitation to look more closely, because the Gnostic perspective is not trying to replace one belief with another. It is asking a deeper question. What kind of being needs to be worshipped? What kind of being demands obedience? What kind of being threatens punishment? What kind of being insists that no other reality exists beyond it? Is that the nature of infinite awareness? Or is it something else? Yaldabaoth, in this vision, is not the ultimate source. It is a flawed emanation, born from imbalance, trapped in its own misunderstanding. And, from this misunderstanding, it begins to create. But here is the crucial detail. It does not create from knowing, it creates from imitation. Because even though Yaldabaoth cannot perceive the pleroma directly, it carries within it faint echoes of the patterns of divine reality, like a distant memory, like fragments of something once known but now distorted. Imagine hearing a symphony through thick walls your entire life. You cannot hear it clearly. You only catch fragments, a rhythm here, a tone there, and then you try to recreate it. You are certain you are reproducing the original, but what you produce is incomplete, slightly off, lacking coherence. This is how Yaldabaoth creates the material world, not as a perfect reflection of divine harmony, but as a distorted copy. And this is where the idea of cosmic deception begins to take shape. Because if the creator of your world does not understand the full reality, then the world itself will carry that limitation. The heavens that Yaldabaoth creates are not boundless. They are structured, contained, limited. A kind of ceiling placed over existence, not out of malice, but out of inability to conceive of infinity. The earth that emerges is not an expression of flowing consciousness. It is governed by fixed laws, mechanical patterns, cause and effect that feels rigid, predictable, binding. Gravity does not feel like love. It feels like force. Time does not feel like freedom. It feels like pressure. Everything operates within boundaries. Everything feels constrained. And then Yaldabaoth does something else. It creates the Archons. These are not just mythological rulers. They represent a system, a structure of control embedded within reality itself. Each Archon governs a domain: thought, emotion, desire, perception, social structures, identity. And unlike the Aeons, which exist in harmony, the Archons operate through hierarchy and control. There is always someone above, someone below, always pressure, always comparison, always the sense that you must align yourself with a system that defines your worth. If you look closely at your own life, you begin to see how this plays out. The voice in your head that tells you you are not enough. The sudden spike of anxiety when you feel you are falling behind. The craving that appears without warning and feels impossible to ignore. The need for validation, for recognition, for approval. The exhaustion from constantly trying to become something. These are not random, they are patterns. And in the Gnostic view, these patterns are not simply psychological. They are structural, embedded in the very way perception operates within the material realm. The Archons do not control you by force. They influence how you see, how you interpret, how you feel, how you react. They keep attention locked into the surface level of experience, into survival, into comparison, into endless striving. Think about how easily your attention is captured. One notification, one comment, one thought about the future, one memory from the past, and suddenly you are pulled away from presence into a loop. You start replaying conversations, imagining outcomes, judging yourself, comparing yourself to others, feeling inadequate, feeling behind, feeling like something is missing. That loop can last minutes, hours, entire days, and the more you are inside it, the more real it feels. This is the prison, not a physical one, and you've felt it before. That moment late at night when everything goes quiet, and underneath all the noise, there is something uncomfortable, a question you cannot fully answer, a feeling that something about this life does not quite fit. That moment is not confusion. That moment is clarity trying to surface, perceptual, emotional, cognitive, a prison made of attention. And because it is invisible, it is rarely questioned. You simply assume that this is what being human feels like. But the Gnostic texts suggest something else. They suggest this structure keeps consciousness outward, fragmented, distracted, and identified with a limited self, not because you are meant to be trapped forever, but because something in the system benefits from that state. This is why the story of Adam and Eve looks different through this lens. Yaldabaoth creates humans, not as an act of love, but as an extension of its own system, a way to populate the world it governs. But even here, something unexpected happens. The pattern of divine humanity, the true template, still exists in the pleroma, and when Yaldabaoth attempts to replicate it, something of that higher pattern slips through. Human beings are not just material forms. They carry something more, a spark, a fragment of the original light. This creates a contradiction, because now you have beings that exist within a limited system, but carry within them something that belongs to a higher reality. And that creates tension, a tension you can feel. The sense that you are part of this world, but not fully at home in it. The sense that no matter what you achieve, something still feels incomplete. The sense that even in moments of pleasure, something deeper is still searching. That is not a flaw, it is a signal. In the story, the garden is not simply paradise. It is containment, a controlled environment, and the tree of knowledge becomes something very different. It is not forbidden because knowledge is dangerous in a moral sense. It is forbidden because knowledge reveals the structure. It reveals that Yaldabaoth is not the ultimate source. It reveals that humans are not meant to remain unconscious within the system. The serpent, often seen as a symbol of deception, becomes something else entirely in this context. A symbol of awakening, a force that introduces the possibility of seeing beyond the limitations imposed by the system. When humans eat from the tree, they do not fall into sin. They begin to see. And that is what the system cannot allow. Because once you begin to see, even slightly, the illusion begins to weaken. You start questioning, Why do I feel this constant pressure to become something? Why do I feel like I am never enough? Why do my thoughts loop in ways I cannot control? Why does validation feel so necessary? Why does fear appear so easily? Why does comparison dominate my perception? Why does the world feel structured in a way that keeps me chasing but never arriving? These questions are not signs of confusion. They are the beginning of clarity. And this is why this knowledge was suppressed. Because if people begin to see that the system they live in is not the ultimate reality, but a limited layer within a much larger structure, then control becomes much harder to maintain. Religious systems, in this view, often become extensions of that control when they direct attention outward, when they tell you that truth is somewhere else, that authority is somewhere above you, that salvation must be granted, that you must obey to be worthy, that you are inherently flawed, that you must depend on an external structure to connect to the divine. All of that reinforces the same pattern: dependence, separation, and the quiet belief that you are not already connected. But beneath all of this, something remains untouched: the spark. And that is where the story begins to turn. Because the system can influence perception, it can shape thought, it can trigger emotion, but it cannot destroy what it does not fully understand. And what it does not understand is the very thing that is reading these words right now. In the next part, that spark will no longer be just an idea. It will begin to feel like something you can actually recognize, something that has been there the entire time, waiting. If part 3 felt like something inside the structure of reality began to crack, this is where that crack becomes personal, not philosophical, not symbolic, personal in the most direct way possible. Because everything that has been described so far, the monad, barbelo, the pleroma, Sophia, Yaldabaoth, the Archons, none of it stays in distant myth. It converges into one simple, unsettling realization. There is something in you that does not belong to this system, not metaphorically, literally. The Gnostic texts call it the divine spark. Sometimes the word used is the pneuma, the breath, the inner essence, the fragment of Sophia herself embedded within human beings when she fell into the lower realms. And this is not described as a symbolic quality like kindness or intelligence. It is described as something real, something living, something that carries memory, not intellectual memory, but a deep recognition of origin. This is why your experience as a human being often feels contradictory. You can function in the world. You can work, achieve, compete, build an identity, follow the structures that society presents. But at the same time, there is this quiet, persistent sense that something is missing. Something does not fully align. You can reach goals and still feel empty. You can gain validation and still feel unseen. You can be surrounded by people and still feel alone in a way that has nothing to do with others. That feeling is not failure. It is not weakness. It is not something to fix. It is the signal of the spark. Because the spark remembers something that your conscious mind does not. It remembers a state of being that is not fragmented, not pressured, not driven by lack. It remembers what it is to exist without the constant background noise of becoming. And that is why certain moments in your life feel so different. Moments when time seems to slow down. Moments when your thoughts fall silent, even briefly. Moments when you feel connected to something you cannot define. Moments when beauty, music, silence, or even pain suddenly opens something deeper. Those moments are not anomalies. They are glimpses, not of something outside you, of something within you that has always been there. This is why spiritual awakening, in the Gnostic sense, is not about gaining something new. It is about remembering, not remembering in the way you recall facts, but remembering in the way something becomes unmistakably clear without needing explanation. This is what the Gnostics called gnosis, not belief, not faith, not intellectual understanding, direct knowing, the kind of knowing that does not come from thinking, but from seeing. Not seeing with the eyes, but with awareness itself. And when gnosis begins, it does not announce itself dramatically. It often starts quietly, a subtle shift in how you relate to your own thoughts, A moment where you notice a fear arise, and instead of being consumed by it, you see it. A moment where a craving appears, and instead of reacting immediately, you observe it. A moment where the familiar voice of self-doubt speaks, and for the first time, you recognize that it is a voice, not your identity. That gap, that space between awareness and reaction, that is where the spark begins to move. Because the archonic system depends on identification. It depends on you believing that your thoughts are you, your emotions define you, your desires control you. The moment you begin to observe, rather than identify, something shifts. You are no longer fully inside the system. You are looking at it, and that changes everything. Think about how much of your energy is consumed every day by automatic patterns. Endless mental commentary, replaying past events, imagining future scenarios, comparing yourself to others, feeling inadequate, chasing validation, avoiding discomfort, trying to control outcomes. This constant movement drains you. It keeps you busy, reactive, and externally focused. It leaves very little space for awareness to recognize itself. And yet, when you pause, even briefly, something else becomes available. Not a new idea, a different state. Stillness, clarity, presence. At first, it feels fragile, easy to lose, easily interrupted by the next thought, the next distraction, the next emotional trigger. But each time you return to it, even for a few seconds, something strengthens. Not effort, not discipline in the conventional sense. Recognition. You begin to see thoughts arise and pass, instead of defining who you are. Emotions are not permanent. They surge and dissolve. Identity is not fixed. It shifts depending on context, memory, expectation. And as this becomes clearer, something else begins to happen. You start reclaiming energy. Energy that was previously locked inside reaction, inside fear loops, inside compulsive thinking, inside emotional patterns that repeat without resolution. You do not reclaim it by force. You reclaim it by no longer feeding what drains it. When a thought arises and you do not follow it, energy returns. When an emotion appears and you allow it without resistance or identification, energy stabilizes. When a craving surfaces and you observe it without acting on it immediately, energy gathers. This is not suppression. It is clarity. And over time, this changes your relationship to everything. The world does not disappear. Responsibilities do not vanish. You still live, work, interact, navigate challenges. But something fundamental shifts in how you experience it. And that awareness weakens its grip. This is why the Gnostics emphasize direct knowledge over belief, because belief can still operate within the system. You can believe something deeply and still be trapped in the same patterns of fear, comparison, and dependence. But direct knowing changes the structure of perception itself. It is not something you can be convinced of. It is something you see, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. This also explains why many spiritual systems, over time, become distorted. Because once the original insight is translated into doctrine, ritual, and hierarchy, it can be reabsorbed into the same system it was meant to transcend. Instead of pointing inward, it begins to point outward. Instead of encouraging recognition, it encourages dependence. Instead of awakening the spark, it reinforces identity. You are told what to believe. You are told what to fear. You are told what to seek. And gradually, the original purpose is inverted. What was meant to free becomes something that binds. This is what can be called counterfeit spirituality. It looks like truth. It uses the language of truth, but it keeps you in the same pattern. Seeking outside, waiting, trying to become worthy, trying to reach something that feels distant. But the Gnostic view points somewhere else entirely. It points to what is already here, already present, already active. The spark does not need to be created. It needs to be recognized. And as more individuals begin to recognize this, something begins to shift collectively, not in a dramatic, visible way at first, but like a field slowly changing, because perception is not isolated. The way one person sees influences the way others see, not through force, but through resonance. When awareness stabilizes in one place, it becomes easier for it to stabilize in another. When clarity emerges in one mind, it subtly affects the collective. This is not mystical in the exaggerated sense. It is structural, because the system depends on unconsciousness, and every moment of awareness weakens that dependence. You may have felt this already. Moments where being around certain people feels different, less reactive, less tense, more clear. Not because they are trying to influence you, but because their state of awareness shifts the field of interaction. This is how awakening spreads, quietly, without announcement, without authority, and it begins with something very simple. Seeing your thoughts as thoughts, seeing your emotions as movements, seeing your identity as a construct, and recognizing that beneath all of it, there is something that does not move, something that does not change, something that has been present through every experience you have ever had. That is the spark, and it is not separate from the source. But the story does not end here, because even though the spark can awaken, even though awareness can recognize itself, there is still a deeper movement, a return, not a physical return, not a journey through space, a return through recognition, a movement back through the layers of distortion into the fullness from which everything emerged. And this is where the idea of Christ consciousness, not as a figure, but as a function, begins to take its place. That is where the final part begins. If everything up to this point has been about remembering what was hidden, then this final movement is about recognizing what has been moving through the story the entire time. Not as a character, not as a savior in the traditional sense, but as a function, a living process, a current that enters the system not to control it, but to reveal it. The Gnostic texts speak of something called autogenes, the self-born, often translated or associated with Christ, but not in the narrow historical sense that later traditions emphasize. Not a figure confined to a single moment in time, not an external authority to worship, but an eternal expression of the monad itself, a movement of awareness designed to penetrate the illusion and awaken the spark within. This is where the story shifts again. Because if the monad is the source, and barbelo is the first knowing, and the Aeons are the unfolding, and Sophia represents the descent into experience, then autogenes represents the return, not by force, not by command, by recognition. According to the secret book of John, this movement is sent into the lower realms to reveal what has been forgotten, to expose the Archons and their influence, to remind the fragments of consciousness of their origin, to break the cycles that keep awareness trapped in repetition, to dissolve the illusion not by destroying it, but by making it visible. And this is where the idea of Christ consciousness begins to make sense in a way that feels immediate rather than distant, not as something you worship, as something that awakens within you. When the historical figure of Jesus says that his kingdom is not of this world, this can be heard in a completely different way, not as a rejection of the world, but as a statement about the nature of reality. The pleroma, the fullness, does not belong to the structure of the material system. It is not bound by its laws, its hierarchies, its limitations. And the same is true for the spark within you. The original message was not about external salvation. It was about inner awakening, not about becoming worthy, not about earning grace, not about obeying authority. It was about recognizing that what you are at the deepest level is already connected to the source. But over time, something changed. The message was inverted. What was meant to awaken became something to believe in. What was meant to liberate became something to follow. The awakener became an object of worship. The path inward was redirected outward. Instead of being told that you carry the spark, you are told that you are incomplete. Instead of being encouraged to see directly, you are told to believe. Instead of recognizing awareness, you are taught to submit to authority. And this inversion fits perfectly within the structure described earlier, because it keeps you dependent. It keeps you seeking externally. It keeps the system intact. But the original function of Christ consciousness remains. It appears wherever awareness begins to recognize itself, and you can begin to see its signs, not in dramatic displays, but in very subtle shifts. Direct knowing, not belief, not hope, knowing. The kind of knowing that does not need to be defended, that does not rely on external confirmation, that feels as obvious as your own awareness once you notice it. Compassion that goes beyond judgment, not passive acceptance, but a clarity that sees through behavior to the underlying structure. That recognizes that even those acting unconsciously are still expressions of the same source, filtered through layers of distortion, and the ability to see through illusion, not as a way to feel superior, but as a natural consequence of awareness stabilizing. You begin to notice the patterns that once controlled you, the narratives that shaped your identity, the systems that reinforce separation, the constant push toward distraction. You begin to see how attention is pulled, how desire is triggered, how fear is amplified, how identity is constructed. And once you see it, it does not disappear instantly, but it loses its invisibility. It becomes something you can observe rather than something that defines you. This is awakening, not an escape from the world, a different way of being within it. And this leads into what the Gnostics describe as the return, not in a physical sense, but as a movement of consciousness. A return through recognition. They describe stages, not as rigid steps, but as shifts in awareness. The first is gnosis, the direct recognition that you are not the content of your experience, not the thoughts, not the emotions, not the identity constructed over time, but the awareness in which all of that appears. When this recognition stabilizes, even briefly, something fundamental changes. The voices that once dominated your mind begin to lose authority. The feeling that you must constantly become something begins to weaken. The pressure to prove yourself begins to dissolve, not because life becomes easier, but because your relationship to it changes. You are no longer trying to get something from the world. You are expressing something through it. The second movement is what can be called the ascent through the layers of experience. Not a journey through space, but through perception. You begin to notice when you are pulled into fear, into scarcity, into comparison. Instead of being consumed, you see it. You recognize the state, and that recognition creates space. You can feel anxiety without becoming it. You can observe thoughts without following them. You can experience emotion without being defined by it. This is not detachment in the cold sense. It is clarity, a deeper presence that can hold everything without being overwhelmed. The third movement is reunion with the current represented by barbelo, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived experience. Your thoughts begin to feel less like isolated mental events and more like expressions moving through a larger field. Insights arise without effort. Connections appear without forced thinking. You find yourself knowing things you did not learn in the usual way, not because you have become special, but because the filter has thinned. Your mind becomes more transparent, less reactive, more aligned. And through that alignment, something greater moves. The fourth movement is reabsorption into the monad, but this is often misunderstood. It is not disappearance, not loss of individuality. It is recognition. The recognition that individuality was never separate to begin with, like a wave, realizing it is the ocean, still moving, still expressing, but no longer defined by its temporary form. And from that recognition, life continues. You still exist in the world. You still act, speak, feel, engage, but something is fundamentally different. You are no longer operating from lack. You are no longer driven by the constant need to become. You are not trying to reach something. You are expressing what is already here. And this changes even the most ordinary aspects of life. Work becomes expression rather than obligation. Relationships become recognition rather than dependency. Challenges become movement rather than threat. Even suffering changes. Not disappearing, but being seen within a larger context. Not as punishment, not as failure, but as part of the unfolding. And here is where this becomes practical in the simplest way. You begin to notice your internal state throughout the day. When fear arises, you recognize it. When craving appears, you observe it. When the familiar patterns activate, you see them, not with resistance, not with judgment, just recognition. And that recognition begins to dissolve their power. You return, again and again, to the awareness that is reading, seeing, experiencing, not as an idea, as a direct experience. And over time, this becomes more stable, more natural, less effort, until it is no longer something you do. It is simply how you are. And as this stabilizes, something else becomes clear. There was never a moment where you were separate. There was only a period where you believed you were. The return was never a journey across distance. It was a shift in recognition. And the most unexpected part of all of this is how quiet it is. No dramatic event, no final moment of arrival, just a gradual unfolding. A deepening clarity, a growing stillness, a sense that what you were searching for was never outside you. And perhaps that is why this knowledge was hidden, not because it is complicated, but because it is simple in a way that dissolves the need for everything built around seeking. And if something in you feels that recognition, even faintly, even uncertainly, then something has already begun. Not as a conclusion, as an opening. After everything you have just walked through, this is where it all quietly settles. Not as a conclusion, but as a recognition. The map you've seen, from the unknowable monad to Barbelo, from the fullness of the pleroma to Sophia's descent, from the rise of Yaldabaoth to the structure of the Archons, was never just a distant myth or abstract cosmology. It was a way of describing something that touches your own experience more closely than it first appears. You've seen how a reality can be mistaken for something ultimate, how systems can form around that mistake, and how even spiritual paths can become part of the same structure they claim to transcend. And yet within all of it, something remains untouched. The spark was never destroyed, only hidden. The search you may have felt, the questions that never quite go away, the sense that something about life doesn't fully add up, but all of it begins to make a different kind of sense when seen through this lens. Not as a problem to solve, but as a quiet remembering. And maybe that's the most unexpected part. Nothing here asks you to become anything else. It simply reflects what might already be there, beneath the noise. Personally, I see this not as something to believe in, but as something that invites a deeper way of looking at ourselves and the world. I'm curious how this felt to you. Did any part of this resonate or challenge the way you see reality? If you want, you can just comment, "I understood it," or share your own thoughts. And if you'd like to keep exploring ideas like this together, you can leave a like or subscribe. Thank you for being here and staying all the way through.